Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Stefano Girolano. I'm the director of the Remark Institute. And with me, I have Samantha Paul and Amy Nguyen, and you probably met Lauren Lee downstairs. Thank you also to the Institute for Public Knowledge. Where's Eric? Hi, Eric, for organizing this with us. I'm delighted to be reintroducing to you Nils Gilman and Jonathan Blake. Nils is Associate Director of Programs at the Berggruen Institute, where he directs the research projects and wider research agenda for the Planetary program.
That's him.
Wait, did I confuse the two of you?
Yes.
Yeah, I did. Sorry, I don't know how I attached you. Niels is the Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President at the Berggruen Institute. That's a little bit more to point. And John is Associate Director of Programs at Berggruen, where he directs the research projects and the research agenda for the Planetary program. They'll talk to us today about Children of a Modest Star, Planetary Thinking in an Age of Crises, which is shortlisted for the 2024 NIAF Al-Rodhan Book Prize. Now, as they write, this is a book about rethinking institutions and governance, especially at the planetary level. A book, quote, about how to design institutions that can pursue policies to effectively manage planetary issues. The incredibly difficult and I think brave task of the book, which we will get to discuss, is the vision of the future that they're thinking of. They come to this from, in some respects, different fields, though I understand that you have known each other a very long time. Niels, besides his status as COO and Executive Vice President at Berggruen, is the Deputy Editor of Noema magazine and was already linked to Remark as a participant in the 2014 seminar on the NIEO. He's the author of Mandarins of the Future. What a perfect title, by the way, all this time later, which is on modernization theory and its planning technologies and predictive artifacts. Quote from this, it's about modernist ideas about development, but seeing modernist ideas about development at the time of their birth while their intellectual capillaries remained visible before they were exposed to the harsh glare of political reality and policy compromise. So on the one hand, the book figured out how modernization, I didn't realize that was a backhanded compliment, that was not my intent. How modernization theorists identified progress and thought about the imposition of elites, economic and political ideals onto the masses, how that was going to work, and it serves as a kind of belated and historical critique of the world that modernization theory created as they posited American society at the apex of the world. He's also the author of Deviant Globalization, Black Market Economy in the 21st Century from 2011. Now, here's the passage where I copy-pasted wrongly about John, who is also associated editor at Noema and the author of Contentious Rituals, Parading the Nation in Northern Ireland from 2019. Contentious Rituals concerns Protestant parading in Northern Ireland, and it's based on careful sociological and ethnographic work, much of which concerns the question of how political and sectarian violence can be construed by its participants, by its actors, as cultural, even anti-political, rather than fundamentally political. So you can see how they're both from different angles in their past work, key people to push from the historical and the sociological toward current problems. And in fact, within their remit is not simply the current problems, but looking past and through our current problems and into the future. So I'm delighted that we'll get to hear you on the planetary and subsidiarity and the other ideas of the book. And I think I'm going to stop there. Please join me in welcoming Nils and John. Sorry for the matter.
Thank you, Stefanos, and thank you, Eric, also for helping to organize this event, and for Sam for helping to put this whole thing together. It's an honor to be. I've actually, as Stefanos remarked or mentioned, I have been affiliated. I did an event here, not here at the Remark Center, but I did it at the Kendersteg facility. And this is the first time I'm actually in the NYU piece of it. So it's an honor to be here. So maybe one thing we could do to start this is to talk about the origin of the book. So it was the summer of 2020 that John and I first started talking about possibly writing this book. And obviously we all remember what was going on in the summer of 2020. It was the height of the pandemic. And the kind of point of departure for us was this sort of shock that the response of the world to the arrival of the pandemic was not to coordinate particularly, but to retreat to the national. The first thing that happened all over the world was everybody tried to shut the borders and hopefully keep the virus out. And as we all know, that didn't work anywhere. The virus continued to fly around the world because the virus does not care about our borders. But the governance systems we have are all about our borders. And John will talk about that in a second. As we started first talking about that, we also talked about how it seemed like, the term polycrisis hadn't quite been popularized yet. Came out of that moment, really. Adam Tooze really picked that idea up. We were talking about what was effectively the polycrisis. It's not just that there's the pandemic, there's also climate change that we've all been worried about now for decades at this point. You may remember that one of the things that was remarked on when there were all the shutdowns of businesses is that the amount of climate emissions fell through the floor. And it was kind of amazing that we saw this real shift in the chemistry of the atmosphere as a byproduct, a feedback effect of the emergence of this tiny little virus, which was now affecting humans. And the sort of biogeochemical feedback loops that we were observing was kind of just crazy, right? I mean, we understood that like humans were embedded in systems of systems, and that we are really one part of a biofeedback mechanism, biogeochemical feedback mechanism over the whole planet. So that was sort of interesting discussions that John and I were having that summer. And we realized maybe there was something here that was not just a weird scientific phenomenon, but maybe also a political phenomenon at the same time. And this brought us back to thinking about what is kind of, I guess, the intellectual point of departure for this book, which is Dipesh Chakrabarty's work from now starting 15 years ago. He's written a whole series of articles. I'm sure many of you are aware of them, where he makes this fundamental distinction between the global on the one hand and the planetary on the other. So I'm sure most of you know this, but I'll rehearse this briefly. What Chakrabarty argues is that the globe of globalization, as we understand it, I mean, those two terms in layman's terms are often used interchangeably, but Chakrabarty makes this fundamental distinction between the globe of globalization, which refers to the flows of things around the earth that humans are intentionally moving around the earth: goods, services, ideas, money, criminal elements. That's stuff I wrote about in my last book, but it's anthropocentric things that humans are moving with intention. The planetary, in Chakrabarty's distinction, by contrast, refers to also the flows of things around the world, biogeochemical things that are often being perturbed by humans through what Earth system scientists call anthropogenic forcings, but that are not things that we move intentionally and don't care about our borders. The globe of globalization moves because we move things around the Earth because we want to move goods and services from one place to another, either because there's a lack of resources in one place where there's demand in the other, or perhaps there is some sort of a price arbitrage or a regulatory arbitrage. But it basically has to do with the mismatch between human desires in one part of the Earth and human desires in another part of the Earth. The biogeochemical things that we're perturbing are not because we're doing it intentionally. Nobody's intending to perturb the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle. Nobody's intending to disturb nature and provoke the emergence of new zoonotic diseases. These are things that happen unintentionally because of human activity. And because they are unintentional, they don't have anything to do with our human institutions, they're not about our borders. The globe of globalization is fundamentally about our borders and moving things between different jurisdictional units. But the biogeochemical things of the planetary are not about our borders. They move regardless of that. And so we realized, thinking about the particular political crisis that we were seeing in 2020, that maybe there was something we could do from a theoretical perspective with Chakrabarty's distinction to actually think anew about governance. And I'll let John start talking about that.
So, echo notes. Thank you so much for coming and for hosting us today. So, we kind of took a look at this emerging understanding of the planet that's come through Earth system science, systems ecology, other kind of scientific disciplines that really, in a pretty remarkable and unnoticed way, transformed how scientists are understanding the world, and how that kind of scientific understanding had been starting to be translated by in particular philosophers of science and some other important figures in humanities and social sciences. And we said, well, okay, so there's this really important new understanding of the Earth. There's this really important critique based on that understanding. But then you have kind of governance chugging along completely as if none of this had happened, right? You know, our governance system in many ways is built on a fundamentally Newtonian foundations, right? Like, and it's no surprise, this is about the same era that governance, you know, the modern state starts to be established. That, you know, we have this kind of atomistic view and this very kind of one-to-one, you know, force that like of you know, cause and effect that is really the foundation in a way that like it's so fundamental we don't even really notice it. It's the water that we're swimming in. But it turns out a lot of that science has been upended, right? So this is like based in large part on the idea that humans are the sole rational, intelligent actor in the world. And that therefore we are kind of sit at the top and can do whatever we want. And it was, you know, the premise of modernity in some sense was that we could act on the world and it would just take it. But, you know, by the summer of 2020, that was like kind of clear that that was not the case anymore. So what would it mean then to start of a, you know, governance institutions start with the foundation of this emerging new understanding that says we're embedded in these systems, we're a part of the biosphere, not apart from the biosphere, that we can't just use Earth as like an endless dump for our crap and then, you know, font for our resources. But what sort of institutions could make sense of this, you know, what we call in the book condition of planetarity, this sense that we are completely and inextricably embedded in this vast and complex systems of systems. So to step back for a minute, as Nils was laying out, we have this mismatch between the governance institutions and the emergent problems. The governance institutions are, you know, largely territorially based nation states. We look at a map of the world that we're all familiar with. There's 193 color-coded shapes with lines and, you know, a star denoting the capital that really fundamentally shapes our assumption about how the world works and what the world is. But now we have these things. We have carbon compounds circulating through the atmosphere, animals migrating all over the place, viruses moving around. So, and when those things have come up, the governance system based on these nation states and then the institutions they come together, like the UN, to like work on these problems, just fails again and again and again. And we argue, not originally, but argue, I guess, yet again, that the center of this problem is simply the idea that the sovereign nation state is the proper mode of governance for these things. And so to take an example, sorry, one second. So the nation state, not only individually, which is kind of obvious that like a problem like climate change, one country cannot do anything that would solve this entirely planetary problem, but even when they cooperate together in fora like the United Nations, really what they're doing is coming together as sovereign nation states to kind of still fight out their national battles, just simply at an international stage, rather than acting for the world, acting for the climate, the health, right? We have the World Health Organization, but it turns out does not answer to world health. It answers to its nation states. And we've, you know, saw in the case of the pandemic that when a pandemic breaks out in one of the most powerful nation states in the World Health Organization has basically no power to have it turn over documents or like understand really the, you know, the origins or kind of trace things back so that they could do the work that they would need to do that, you know, that helps everyone. So this to me was like really crystallized. If you ever read the text of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, the 1992 document that set up the global system for governing the climate, and this is the basically international treaty that the Paris Agreement comes out of. So if you read the original text of the treaty, it says really nice, beautiful things like the climate belongs to all mankind, and this problem that we see coming down the pipe that we're, you know, pumping a bunch of stuff in the atmosphere, creating climate change is something that requires global cooperation. And it's, you know, all of our problem, we should all be part of the solution. So that's like the good part, like, yay, global cooperation. But then it says like a couple lines later, but the fundamental foundation of this treaty is nation state sovereignty. I think the explicit is like, we reaffirm that the sovereign nation state is the main thing. And that means blah, 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 that states have the sovereign right to do whatever they want, including, and this is explicitly in the treaty, use their resources however they want. So it's like right there in the climate change treaty is an explicit line saying they can pump and burn as much oil and coal as they'd like. And it's not the UN's fault. I mean, this is how the world was designed, is that you have these sovereign states that can essentially do whatever they want. This doesn't make sense in this world where not only are the problems things that flow across borders like wars or trade, that are fundamentally human to human. But right now we have a system that's like designed to either cooperate among humans or stop disputes among humans, being now tried to be transformed into an institution that basically interfaces with things that are completely indifferent to human intentions, like, like we keep saying, carbon compounds, viruses, space junk, ocean plastics, biodiversity, etc. So this is, basically the long statement of the problem. What we then tried to do, like I said, is think, okay, what if we started over? What if we started from new foundations? And this is, so the second half of the book ends up kind of basically being normative political theory about, well, what might we do with a different starting point that begins with this understanding of embeddedness and interdependence, rather than kind of the idea of the sovereign nation built upon the sovereign human individual. And briefly, what we end up arguing is another way of thinking about how we might design governing the world that we think is much better aligned to the structure of these problems, which on the one hand, we've mainly been talking about so far are planet-wide, right? The carbon compounds become basically an undifferentiated part of the atmospheric chemistry, and that is impacting the world. But the way in which we human beings, and any other species for that matter, experience climate change is not as this overall thing. No one experiences the 1.1 or 1.2 degrees Celsius warming that there's already been. And like, we have these targets of 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius that we want to stop climate change from going to. This is a global average. No one actually experiences that. In some places like the Arctic, they've experienced much more climate change, up to like 4 degrees. Other places, it's much less. Some places are warmer, some places are a little colder, some places get too much rain, some places not enough. So what really matters is on the one hand, what matters is twofold, and this is particularly what nation states are bad at. On the one hand, it's things that are much broader than the nation state. On the other hand, the consequences are hyper local. So the way climate change is experienced here in New York is actually very different from how it's experienced where we live in Los Angeles. Here, the problems are storm surges, rising sea levels, hurricanes, things like that. In LA, it's droughts, fires, heat waves, etc. And these are just, despite having the same kind of planetary wide cause, the impacts are hyper local. And again, having this having sovereignty nested at the meso layer, at the meso level, the nation state, is really incompatible with this kind of structure of a lot of problems that we have. The same with pandemics. It's the microbes circulating around the world that is what makes it a pandemic. But again, what we really care about is, when it shut down our neighborhoods. I mean, that's fundamentally how it's experienced socially and politically. So we say, well, what if we tried to design a system that could deal with this? So very briefly, we sketch out an idea for a multi-scalar system of governance that would include what we call planetary institutions, which would have a worldwide remit on particular kind of specific planetary problems like climate change or pandemics, that would not be world government, right? These would not be kind of an all-purpose layer of institution that governs everything around the world, because that also wouldn't solve this problem of cause and effect happening at very different layers or different levels. So not world government, it's also, again, not global governance, so wouldn't be made up of like many different countries coming together to represent their own interests at a different scale. It would instead be something that really has its remit, has its jurisdiction to be the planet, because we think this gives you a fundamentally different viewpoint, understanding of where you act, why you act, etc. Then skip nation state for a second, and then like at the other end of things, we promote a lot more governance at the local level, which are, on the one hand, closer to populations, so that they can be kind of more democratically attuned with local preferences, culture, politics, etc. Additionally, be more in line with local climatic, geological, ecological conditions. And so the question is then, how do you stitch together all these different layers? Because in some sense, this could be a recipe for chaos. And maybe it still will be. I mean, I can't guarantee that it won't be. But we promote an idea that we call planetary subsidiarity. So here we're at a Center for Europe. So I imagine many people are familiar with the principle of subsidiarity, but for those who aren't, it's a political principle that says that things should be governed at the smallest scale at which they can be adequately resolved. So this is not decentralization, though it's often mistaken for that, which says like things should be pushed down as low as possible, kind of no matter the consequence. This is really a functionalist understanding of making decisions about the allocation of authority in a multi-level system. Is that on the one hand, you do want to push things down, but not so far that they can't be resolved, but like they should be kind of, it's a tool for gauging the proper level that gets both kind of smallest scale that makes sense, and also it can work. And when we add the adjective planetary to this concept of subsidiarity, what we came to understand is that this new emerging understanding of the planet as kind of a integrated whole, that for some problems, the smallest scale at which they can be resolved is in fact the planet itself. So that's what helps us understand which small or which set of issues could be best or maybe or adequately governed at the planet itself. These are the things that you move up to this top level or broadest level. But most other things should be really pushed much farther down the range. So turn back to you, Larry.
Sure. One of the things we're trying to do in this book is offer a kind of new conceptual vocabulary for understanding all of this. I'll get into a couple of extra terms in a second, but maybe I should describe the structure of the book, because one of the things I think that is unusual about this book, certainly for it's not particularly normal for a scholarly or academic book, is that there's really three pieces to it. The first part of our argument is a historical argument about how did we end up with the governance system that we have today, focused on nation states. It's actually a much more recent phenomenon than most of us realize. At the time my father was born, in 1944, the majority of human beings did not live in a national state. They lived in empires or condominia or mandates or city-states, or there were a variety of other things. It was only really in the post-war period of decolonization that we ended up with the national state as the primary, the predominant, if not hegemonic form in which governance should be delivered. And one of the things that we talk about in that first chapter is how that was not actually what even many of the post-colonial leaders, who today are often remembered as the fathers of their country, wanted. Kwame Nkrumah wasn't looking for an independent Ghana. He was looking for a federation of West Africa. Likewise, when Britain exited the Caribbean in the 1960s, the initial plan, the initial actual fact was that they tried for a Pan-Caribbean confederation before they broke into pieces. Similar things happened in Southeast Asia. Pan-Arabism produced ideas for Egypt and Syria actually became unified for a few years. And it was only really towards the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s that the nation state became the predominant form of governance, and became the assumed way in which legitimacy of governance would be achieved. So that's the first part of the book. The second part of the book proposes a kind of conceptual genealogy of several key terms, including the idea of planetarity, the idea of subsidiarity, putting those two things together, and linking them together through, and here's another piece of terminology, something that we borrowed from one of our colleagues at the Berggruen Institute, Benjamin Bratton, the idea of planetary sapience, the idea that knowledge is being created of the world and of the planet itself that we need to enhance on a continuous basis. And then the last piece of the book goes from history to intellectual genealogy to normative political theory. And really putting those three things together, I think, is what makes this book unusual. I think that I want to say a couple of other things. So in terms of the normative political theory, we do believe that like there should be narrowly segmented planetary institutions, narrowly segmented because a world government, first of all, is probably not at all viable. Second of all, would become a single point of failure, possibly a single point of tyranny for the planet. Whereas functionally specified planetary institutions to deal with truly planetary scale phenomena has at least some greater opportunity to be not a single point of failure on those things. I think it also could be achieved much more incrementally rather than a world government, which would require a wholesale revolution in a way that we don't think is particularly likely to take place. The other principle we talk about is that as you push things to the smaller jurisdictions, it's not that you're just abandoning, it's not just decentralization, as John said, it's not you're abandoning these smaller jurisdictions to their own devices to deal with the particular problems they have locally. We also strongly encourage that there be translocal collaboration networks, and these things actually already exist. So for example, to use the New York versus LA example, there's no reason why Washington, DC should be setting climate change adaptation targets for both Los Angeles and New York. These are totally different situations, but it does make sense for Los Angeles to collaborate with other cities that face similar kinds of climate change adaptation related challenges. These will typically be cities in the southwest corners of continents that have Mediterranean climate. So kind of climate change challenges of Los Angeles are very similar to the climate change challenges of Lisbon or Cape Town or Perth in Australia. And in fact, these cities are collaborating with one another, sharing best practices, sharing expertise networks, sharing resources in some cases, so that they can coordinate on how to actually do things. And one of the examples we talk about that's sort of interesting is the collaboration between Rotterdam in the Netherlands with Jakarta in Indonesia. Indonesia, of course, was a former colony of the Netherlands. And this is kind of a post-colonial form of collaboration that's quite interesting because beyond the historical relationship between Indonesia and the Netherlands, both of these cities are cities that are at sea level, that are sinking, and that face major hydrological challenges. And the hydrological expertise that the Dutch have developed turns out to be extremely useful for the Jakartans as they try to figure out how to keep that city from literally sinking into the Sunda Sea. So that's the sort of architectural thing that we imagine. What remains of the nation state in this context? I think two things remain one thing remains for the nation state. The one thing that we think the nation state still remains essential for is related to the reason why it became hegemonic in the third quarter of the 20th century. The central reason why the nation state was settled on as the primary form of governance and administrative delivery is that the central project of the third quarter of the 20th century, and this is related to the topic of my first book on modernization theory, was the project of modernization, which was also sometimes called economic development, which was also sometimes called nation building. And that project centered on the nation state because it turns out historically, the nation state is practically the only institutional vehicle which has ever been effective at creating positive distributional outcomes. Now, of course, many nation states don't do that. They've gotten worse at it in the last 25 to 50 years, depending on how you want to measure our contemporary period. But certainly in the third quarter of the 20th century, the central debate of the Cold War on some level was what was going to be the better mechanism for achieving economic development. Was it going to be it was going to be state socialism in the mold of the Soviet Union, or was it going to be a liberal democratic capitalism of some sort? Or perhaps an authoritarian capitalism is what actually turned out to win. But that project of the nation state to do economic development remains, I think, something that national governments will continue to do more effectively than neither planetary scale institutions or local institutions are going to be able to do. So that's sort of what we think continues to be the important function of the national government. I want to give one final example of this and then talk about sort of what the ethical substrate of this entire argument is. So let me just talk about one example of what we mean by a planetary institution so you can understand administratively what it would look like. We're imagining, for example, that there might be a planetary organization for the reduction of carbon. And what that institution would be charged with is, on the one hand, enhancing planetary sapience, enhancing our planetary knowledge of the phenomenon of planetary scale climate change. So sensor networks, managing the supercomputers, doing many of the things that the IPCC already does today. The IPCC does do those things. But then in addition to that, it would have the power and the authority to mandate binding emissions targets. Those carbon budgets, if you will, would then be passed to national governments to actually implement. Why national governments? Because of course, actually implementing carbon-related targets is going to have strong implications for the economic choices that those countries have to make. How do you remake your economy in light of changing or reducing your carbon budget is going to have major economic implications. And the national state and the national government is the correct place to make those kinds of decisions. The national governments then might further pass down mandates to subnational units to actually figure out how to do the adaptation and the implementation. So some places like, some countries might decide they want to go deep on nuclear powers. Others might want to electrify their passenger fleet, their ground transportation fleet more quickly. Some might choose to reduce the amount of meat that is being consumed in and that will depend entirely on the one hand, the economic affordances of those regions. On the other hand, the preferences of their populations, and then actually the ecological circumstances that they find themselves in. So that's sort of the way we imagine this cascading out. I'm sure people are going to ask us why we think anybody would want to do this, or why political people would ever agree to this. And I have some answers to that I'll get to in a second. But I want to leave, before we get to that final point, I want to just suggest that there's a moral and ethical substrate to all of this that I think is important and worth raising in an academic context, which is that, as John alluded to, our political institutions that we've been talking about, the national government, the principle of democracy is one person, one vote, these kinds of basic principles emerge basically in the 17th and 18th century during the period of Newtonian mechanics, that understood humans as uniquely as unique creatures, that were unique political actors in the tradition of Aristotle and the Zoon Politikon, because we were the only creatures that had free will, we were the only creatures that had language, and that language was the basis of politics. What we now know is that that's just not the case. The systems of systems in which we're embedded not only suggest that we are not totally rational and autonomous individuals, but are in fact deeply interdependent with the systems that we're embedded in. We also know that we're not the only rational creatures and we're not the only preference-bearing creatures in the world. There are increasing exercises, and John's going to be meeting with one of the very interesting researchers who's doing work on that, who's here at the City University of New York, a fellow by the name of David Gruber, who works on whale song, specifically sperm whale song in the Caribbean and the North Atlantic more broadly. And he's been actually for years capturing the whale songs and is now using large language models to essentially divine the grammar of the whales. And he's figured out the whales give each other names and so on. I think over time and very soon, because of technology, it's going to be possible to, in much more specific ways, understand the preferences of non-human creatures. And it's not just going to be megafauna like whales that we're going to be able to do that for. It's also going to be other kinds of creatures. We work with people in the forestry school at Berkeley who are setting up sensor networks across the mountains in California that are tracking the pheromones of insects to detect the possibility of colony collapse, and are checking the moisture levels and other kinds of stress indicators for forests to show them the risk of forest fires. And these things are all allowing us essentially to understand the preferences of non-human others. And the question is, how are we going to include them in our politics? This is a fundamentally post-anthropocentric understanding of politics that subtends all of this. Okay, but why would anybody in Moscow or Beijing or DC be willing to do any of this? This is a question we get all the time. The basic reason is that they're going to be held responsible for things that they can't control, and no politician likes that. All right, and I want to tell one story that can illustrate what this could look like. So, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Does anybody here work on anything related to the IAEA? Okay, so the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is a technocratic organization based in Vienna, in Austria, was set up in the late 1950s, initially kind of at the behest of the Eisenhower administration in order to manage the nuclear fuel cycle, because the Eisenhower administration wanted to provide nuclear power to people while limiting the risk of nuclear weapons proliferation. And so the original remit of the IAEA in the late 1950s was basically to manage the nuclear fuel cycle for civilian nuclear uses. But in the mid-1960s, it was given a very different remit. It was given the remit actually to be allowed to intrusively inspect any nuclear facility in the world. Okay? That's a massive violation of sovereignty. Why would any country agree to that? Well, there's a pretty basic reason, and you guys, some of you will probably immediately have guessed it. The reason is that in 1962, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we came as close, we the planet, we the human beings, we all the multi-species on this planet, came as close to nuclear apocalypse as we ever have, at least as far as we know. You know, there were 10 days in October where it really looked like there might be a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. And this so scared Moscow and DC that they were willing themselves to give up sovereignty. I mean, you think about what an inspection regime is. This is a pretty severe violation of sovereignty, right? Like these technocrats from Vienna are allowed to jump into your energy production facilities anytime they feel like. You know, that's not something you think that most sovereignty defending countries would be willing to agree to. But they did, because the prospect of a nuclear war or the proliferation of nuclear weapons was so severe that they were willing to give up that sovereignty in order to protect themselves, all right, in the long run. And I believe that actually that is how we will get to these kinds of planetary governance systems. The blurb on the cover of our book is from Kim Stanley Robinson. Has anybody here read his most recent novel, Ministry for the Future, excuse me. So he imagines exactly something like this in the opening chapters of his book. This is no spoiler, and I recommend the book. He imagines that the scenario that unfolds in his novel is that there is a heat wave, a terrible heat wave in North India that kills several tens of millions of people in a matter of a couple of weeks as a result of global warming. And the Indian government then responds to that by saying, okay, this is a national crisis. We're going to engage in unilateral solar geoengineering. We're going to start putting this stuff up. This then freaks out other countries because they're like, oh my God, the Indians are going to make this decision on their own. And this then unfolds a plot that leads eventually to a Ministry for the Future, which has planning, centralized planning. Now, I'm not necessarily endorsing that particular solution that Robinson has in the book. But the point is, it's a crisis that ultimately allows for institutional reform. And so I'll leave you with this last thought. These may sound like science fiction ideas that we ourselves are proposing, but this is how fundamental change does happen over time. How did we end up with the United Nations system? The first person to propose a Parliament of Nations was Immanuel Kant in 1795 in his essay on perpetual peace. And, you know, writing an essay on perpetual peace in the middle of the post-French Revolutionary Wars was a little bit of an, you know, out-of-step moment for him to be saying something like that. And we didn't actually get to an effective Parliament of Nations. We got to a somewhat ineffective one after World War I and a more effective one after World War II. But it took it took the Napoleonic Wars and then 2 additional world wars before the inadequacy of the fully anarchistic system of nation states simply was not acceptable to national governments at all anymore. So it may take some crises before we can get to the kinds of institutions we're talking about. But those crises, if we don't get to those institutions, are in fact inevitable. This is what's known in the scenario planning business that I used to work in as an inevitable surprise. So I believe that the conditions that will drive the kinds of changes we're talking about will eventually happen, almost inevitably. And the question is whether we can get to these institutions faster, so we don't have to have world wars that precipitate it, or whether it can be simply being scared the way we were by the Cuban Missile Crisis into the possibility of building these kinds of institutions going forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you. Thank you, John. I'll have any questions, but I'm going to take chair's prerogative and like effectively 2 of them. One is more content oriented, and I'm curious about the way in which this is a fundamentally anti-economistic. Like, it doesn't really matter what the economic questions or consequences in a kind of basic, you know, in a basic, straightforward, market-oriented scenario would be, or in what the economics of planning would themselves be. And I'm very curious about how you know, if this is like an active decision from the start, or how you handle that kind of economic question, which is problem, and which has, in some ways, a lot to do with what you described as a fundamentally post-anthropocentric politics. There is a different economy, obviously, in the natural world, and that I follow. The second one is a little bit about, a little naughtier as a question. It's a bit about your positioning. Nils, you in particular have written about people who imagine the future and who plan the future. And I'm rather curious about what it is like to be doing that. And under how you understand that positioning that is the one that belongs to the two of you, and in what way that works. Like in a way, how, to what extent, so at one level, it's the, let's say, acute as a question, but at a different level, it's a little bit about institution building and about understanding what the role of the book is. Do you imagine, you more or less suggested now at the end that you imagine the book as a sort of counterpoint that then begins to function as an accelerator, something like that. So I'm curious if that is totally off or how you play with it.
I should probably take the second one. You want to take the first question, or I'll take the second question first, and you can take the first question second. Yeah, I've actually been waiting for somebody to ask me this question. That it's funny that I wrote this, my first book, which I wrote 20 years, well, I really wrote it, really conceived of it almost 30 years ago now. And Mandarins of the Future took a very, I suppose, somewhere between gimlet-eyed and acerbic attitude towards the idea that one can make a fundamental plan based on a single blueprint that would be able to be replicated across national states. So, you know, in a nutshell, that book was really looking at how a bunch of US, mostly political scientists and sociologists, some economists, thought that there was a single model for development that could be replicated in every country, regardless of their historical conditions or economic backgrounds or sociological questions or political affordances or what have you. And I wrote it was a young man's book that was a little bit snarky, I think, it'd be fair to say. I think that what we're proposing here is somewhat different in the sense that, well, where I think I have changed my mind, I've become somewhat more sympathetic to the idea that we need some kinds of technocratic solutions to some things. The question is whether there should be, the thing that I was particularly exercised about in the case of the modernization theorists is the way they became so single-mindedly focused on this that they lost sight of the importance of democratic checks and balances. And they eventually thought that the best way to achieve modernizing goals was by having military dictatorships do it. That's the thing that really kind of exercised me in that book. We're definitely not proposing that any of these things be imposed by military force. With that said, and this is an opinion which is very much out of step with the populist moment that we live in now, we say this explicitly in the book. It's a direct quote from the book. Some people know more about these things than others, right? Like some people, like climate change is not an opinion. Some people think it doesn't exist. They're wrong, okay? Some people understand how viruses work. They might be more important to include in the conversation about how do we manage, you know, epidemiological matters than others. And I really strongly believe that like scientific knowledge is a real thing. Now, this, you know, we've seen during the pandemic the way this went wrong. People said, trust the science. This was a fundamental misunderstanding. And the problem especially was when it said when trust the science became trust the scientists. We should not trust scientists. We also shouldn't trust the results of science. Because the virtue of science, the virtue of the Western model of the scientific method is not that you get things right, that you have a way of being wrong for less long. Right? So there's a process that has to be enforced that I think is really important around the scientific method, right? And I really believe in the scientific method strongly as a kind of epistemological tool for apprehending the world in its empirical reality. Now, from there, the question follows, who should rule on the basis of these ideas? I don't think it should necessarily be the scientists, and we have specific ideas that we propose in the last chapter of their book about the kinds of democratic checks and balances that there should be so that, you know, if the scientists make a decision that's totally outrageous, they can be overridden by a political process, which in our initial framing is primarily about the human, but might eventually become about the extra-human.
I mean, one more thing about that in terms of like how we envision this book. We made a conscious effort. Like I said, the second half of the book is really about institutional design and tries to lay out, you know, somewhat, you know, sketches, not like detailed blueprints for institutions, but sketches of like what they could look like, what they might do, what their goal could be. And there's a specific reason behind that. It isn't just that we think these are the best institutions or we solve the problem and you should go build these right now. I mean, we think they're good ideas. We didn't put out like bad ideas on purpose, but like we wanted to put something that people could actually like sink their teeth into and be like, I actually think it's a bad idea, but it's now made me think like I have now something to respond to, as opposed to just like responding to kind of theoretical claims or critique. There's not like we were trying deliberately to like help create the future by like putting a model out there that you can respond to positively or negatively, as really as a kind of object of debate. So that's so it's kind of one of the point about that. So you described it as anti-economistic, which is absolutely right, and actually in two senses. One, we're clearly arguing against kind of like neoclassical economic as a practice and down to its assumptions of individuality and rationality and like conceptions of value. The book is also maybe anti-economist because we're like a economist, because we actually don't really talk about the economy. We don't talk about capitalism, except it comes up in the conclusion in a list of things that we didn't cover. That's like of open, outstanding questions. And there are several reasons for that. One is that in thinking about super complex changes, it's just useful to not change everything at the same time, but to hold some things steady. So in this case, we kind of held, we kind of like assumed steady state on that so that we could change a bunch of other variables. The other answer is, as much as a lot of the problems of the planet are clearly related to and kind of coincide with global capitalism and really kind of liberal turn, it's not like state socialism was better for the planet either. Like so that's one thing, that it's not exclusively capitalism or like that mode of economic thinking or economic practice. These assumptions are so deeply, I think they're even more, these assumptions being like the assumptions of the old order, I think are almost more deeply embedded in economics than they are in politics. They would just take even a much more broad-based project to tackle, and we kind of, want to be able to actually publish, in time. So I think that's my response.
Let me add one other thing on this. We were up at the Jackson School at Yale talking about the book yesterday. One of our interlocutors there was Dan Esty, who the first time I met him, and his work. He talked about how the World Trade. He's worked at the World Trade Organization. He thinks that the World Trade Organization could be a mechanism for actually implementing some of these things, in the sense that if you embed, particularly on the climate side, he works primarily on climate and environmental issues. Insofar as the reasons why we continue to pump so much carbon into the atmosphere is motivated by economics, the economic sanctions could be a pretty effective way to actually enforce the new rules that would be coming out of this Planetary Organization for the reduction of carbon. So if part of its enforcement arm came through a reformed WTO that embedded environmental and sustainable development goals in it, that might actually be a reasonable enforcement of this.
Thank you. I really mostly wanted something around the moral and political priority over the economic itself. That's Larry and Teresa Young. Larry and Young.
Really inventive thinking. This was great. You make the case persuasively that the nation states got to thin in order to address the problems associated with the planetary. You have this model of functional specificity that, John, I think you make the case, you just hold in place the other side of the equation, the global side, in order to address the planetary side. I'm just wondering whether you see yourselves in dialogue with other thinkers out there who want to thicken the power of the nation state, to strengthen it in order to confront the negative externalities associated with the global. You just mentioned the WTO. When I think back to the 90s, which was the height of globalization, when you were either raging against the WTO in Seattle or everybody else was doing the Macarena, the idea was that the nation state was the only protector of labor rights, redistribution, against global negative byproducts. And so I wonder how you see yourselves in dialogue with those types of thinkers.
We answer this one now. Or,
Go ahead.
So the short answer is that in the current world, that's right. I mean, like that it is the protector of rights, and that it's also the way to get things done. I mean, like I am a strong supporter of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? I mean, wish it could have been more, but like, like that is like in the current world, that's clearly the way we're going to like make progress. The world with the IRA is, American action on that is like clearly better than a world without it. What this project is really trying to do is like, okay, set all that aside for now. It's like, what might we do if you were able to basically start with a clean slate? So the book is I mean, it is a critique, but it's not like, but it's a friendly critique of like those who are like actually doing the work right now. It's like we're not all trying to say like, well, just give up and wait till these new institutions emerge because what you're doing is useless. That's
I also think that,
suicide.
I also think that like this question of what you mean by strengthen the nation state is an actually interesting one. I think we need a more high capacity national state. It just needs to have a narrower remit of things that it's responsible for doing with its greater capacity. And so I think that the IRA is a great thing from our perspective because it's going to actually increase the capacity. It's going to increase our state capacity to do things that can then reduce carbon on an econometric level, right? So that sense, we believe the national state should be strengthened. We're not against the nation state. We're not against the identity and politics of national governments. What we're against is sovereignty over the sovereignty of the nation state and the unitary absolute nature of sovereignty. We think that sovereignty needs to be deconstructed, not the state and the administrative capacity of the state.
Like, we also just try to like think through like that we're stuck in this system that was developed at a very kind of like we kind of said it reached its kind of like true global hegemony in the mid 1960s as a result of the post-war modernization economic development project. And now it's the state was designed to do a particular thing, and now it's been asked to do a bunch of other stuff that turns out it's like not really capable of doing. But there's no reason why, according to like nature or like that the nation is the proper unit of political organization. It's the one that made sense. I mean, basically, originally it solved the problem of response to modernity, both political and economic modernity. It's like, oh, this makes sense. It's like popular sovereignty and like, what do we do about industrialization? That as a scale made sense. But we're now setting a whole different set of problems that doesn't necessarily make sense.
So, Jan?
I would like to connect the question regarding economics coming from Stefanos with the question of enforcement, because if we ask who might be able to enforce this, I think you mentioned the WTO, but it's not only the question of how to persuade the political actors in all of this, and you kind of sketched one scenario where this might have been successful, but it's also the question of how to successfully engage people who have capital power in their hands. And there we have very, very different interests at place who are very much invested in certain path dependencies, and we will have to find a way to kind of get them to let go of certain investments and basically face a form of capital power in order to bring about this change that you're imagining. So it's not only about not thinking economistically, but it's also about thinking in terms of economic power when we think about these types of futures. No.
So I have a joke that I tell sometimes. You know what the difference between a billionaire and an oligarch is? Oligarchs have to answer to the state. They fall out of windows. And in billionaires don't. I mean, the idea of a billionaire in China or Russia doing what Elon Musk is doing right now in this country is totally unthinkable. This is actually where we need to strengthen the state capacity against the billionaires. There's greater state capacity in that sense against the very rich in most every other country than ours. Actually, the power of the very rich in this particular country is without any precedent practically anywhere outside of banana republics, and not even there in many cases. So I actually think that this is a case where we need to strengthen state capacity against the power of capital. And that will happen at national levels, if it happens at all. So I agree this is a huge obstacle to achieving the power of the super rich and the power of capital is a huge problem. But what we've seen in other places, and I'm not here to advocate for Chinese authoritarianism, that's not what I'm suggesting at all, but one can neutralize. I mean, the richest, you know, what's his face? He ran Alibaba. Jack Ma. You know, Jack Ma, the richest and supposedly most powerful businessman in Beijing, was completely neutralized by fiat. So it is possible to imagine a world in which even the super rich, large capital holders are not necessarily the ones in charge of things. That's not the world we live in today. How do we get away from that? It's happened before. In the 1930s, malefactors of great wealth were, you know, the subject of a massive political campaign by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which makes him the best president we've had, in my opinion, in the last 180 years. And we need another FDR.
So, Benedetta?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I mean, it's a fascinating thesis because you seems to be arguing against some sort of 90s or 2000 type of anthropocentric globalism, right? Where, of course, the anthropocentric thesis is so crucial. But of course, as you have a lot of sociologists, political economists in this audience, we criticize the thesis highly. You know, it's been replaced posthumanistic approaches, you know, with the idea of the capitalocene. And so I'm reconnecting to a critique of power, of course, that is missing. Then, I don't know, Jason Moore, you know, critique or a fossil capital critique. And you're replacing this type of anthropocentric globalism with another sort of anthropocentric globalism, in a way, because it seems to me that you're thinking of, you're arguing in favor of another elite globalist institution or set of institutions that will act better than the Council of Europe, of which, as we know, the US is not part, but actually has a very interesting globalist approach. And at the same time, I don't see, and probably it's because we didn't have enough time and I haven't read the book, but I don't see how you're actually including the voices of the environmental justice movement. So the indigenous voices that are so crucial in this conversation about the planetary crisis. So the global south. So, you know, indigenous thinking that is radical in the sense that it led us to, and many environmental economists, to understand approaches of degrowth that are actually gaining ground in this global movement. So I'm curious to see to what extent issues of power are actually taken into consideration, because they are very relevant in this context. And this is perhaps the case, and also the reason why we are skeptical of a vision that doesn't want to talk about the economics of our current crisis, right, together with the political. So, but I'm sure that you took into consideration those voices.
Before you answer, Mina, was your question linked? I saw you nodding. So if it's a link question, let's take them together.
Sort of linked to, especially you're bringing the idea of the indigenous communities into this. So I was wondering if you were suggesting in some way that prior to the growth and dominance of the sovereign nation state, that prior to that, there's evidence of some kind of planetary thinking, which might be useful for the sort of solutions you're thinking of. And more than, I think, a question of, you know, empires being conscious of their constituent parts. So I'd imagine that there's a great deal of centralization, even though regions were far-flung. So I was interested in whether, absent the modern nation state, there's more possibility for this sort of planetary, as long as we have this kind of extractive attitude towards the environment, towards nature. And sort of connected with that, how do you see the role of civil societies, especially when they function in a kind of trans-regional way, and that's sort of beyond Greta Thunberg yelling at everybody to worry about the.
Well, I mean, on the last question about civil society, I mean, we've thought about the book. I mean, we just, again, to kind of contain it, is about formal governance structures. So we kind of leave aside questions of civil society, but obviously, I think practically, they're part of this broader kind of push, part of this broader movement, and would like be part of how we envision this actually operating. So the question of the, multiplicity of voices, both in the present or historically before the state. So, I mean, the historical question, we don't really see, it's not like before the nation state kind of arose, everyone was kind of thinking planetarily. That's not the argument. And in fact, this could be criticized, but like, I mean, the archive of material that we're drawing on, from which we kind of see the concept of the planetary, emerges from Western thought and technoscience, because we use a kind of very technical, scientifically rooted idea that's based in contemporary understandings of biogeochemistry, rather than indigenous ideas that emerged from like living in a place and understanding that place. I mean, so even if they can kind of end up in roughly similar understandings, they come from very different approaches and methods, and it's not that one is necessarily excuse me, better than other, but like in the one. So first of all, the decision we made was because we were trying to reach an audience of people in positions of authority who are basically unaware of any of this thinking. And that's like one of our key audiences, who are mainly steeped in this Western tradition. Whether or not they in fact kind of come out of it, that's the way like elites are trained. That's point one. Point two, my jet lag has made disappear.
Wait, take it?
Go for it. I'm
Sorry.
lost.
So, I mean, one of the kind of, as I mentioned earlier, the principle of multi-species flourishing, I think is really the crucial kind of ethical central point in this entire argument. What we mean by that is that humans can only flourish if we're embedded in ecosystems that are themselves flourishing. This is an idea that comes out of indigenous thought. And in fact, almost every religious and indigenous tradition I know of has ideas that are very similar to this. There's a concept of Mother Earth or multi-generational thinking. In, for example, Native American Lakota thought that I think is very consonant with the kind of long-range thinking that we're proposing here. It's true that the archive that we draw on, if we want to argue about the politics of citation, we probably don't cite those things as much as some people might like us to. But I don't think any of the ideas we're proposing here are at odds with things that I read in those kinds of traditions in any event. So that's one point that I think is really important. The second thing I would just say in response to this is, I'm just candidly not sympathetic to the idea of degrowth. I don't think we are in favor of that idea. It may be a growing trend, but I don't think it's a trend that's likely to succeed because it's very hard. There's a lot of psychological research that shows loss aversion. And I basically think that degrowth involves, in practice, one of two possibilities, if not both. Either it involves the idea that we would make massive reductions in the consumption styles of people in the global north, or it entails making sure that people who are poor stay poor because we don't want to have any more growth. And I don't think either one of those things is politically or ethically viable or good. I'm hostile, absolutely, to the idea of degrowth. I think we need technology, however, very importantly, to be able to make sustainable the kinds of consumption patterns people are already committed to, and that many people who don't yet have them very much want. The idea of a green technology transition is absolutely crucial for making all this happen, which is why things like the IRA are a just barely beginning to get started thing that's really, really important. So this may just be a point of ethical diversion.
Okay, I have a number of questions. Atusa and Daniel, and then three more. But I was going to say, those of you who are online on Zoom, you'll have to type up your questions, please. Shayla, you especially. We don't know if you can see our notes, but we don't have a means of projecting a question and sound in here. Atusa?
Yeah, so you use the term sovereignty a fair bit. And, you're advocating for it to be sort of redefined or reimagined and what it is and who has it. But even just bringing up the term kind of brings out these fire-breathing nationalist impulses in a lot of people. So I was wondering how useful this term is, not only in the rhetoric, but like in thinking through how to achieve these goals.
Before you jump in, let's also take Daniel's.
Thanks. Hi again. We met on the train to New Haven yesterday, so it was a fortuitous meeting before coming here. But I guess I wanted to go back to Steph's and Jan's question about economism and about capital, which I realize is maybe now pushing the point now that Jonathan, you've said explicitly that, in the book, you sideline this. But I suppose my question is one of trying to understand how that move is sensible and logical from your perspective. That is, what is your theory or understanding of capitalism such that putting it to one side, holding it steady, so to speak, as a variable, enables us to talk about changing global governance institutions? It seems like there's some theory in which those variables have to be relatively independent for that move to be made. That doesn't gel with my understanding of how global capital has worked since the 1970s. And I'm curious about what theory of capitalism is undergirding that move to sideline.
I'll let you take on the sovereignty question, but I'll take on the capitalism question. I think part of the reason why we wrote the proposals that we focus on, which are not trying to solve every problem, and they're not trying to solve distributional problems, for example. They're not trying to solve issues of social justice. It's not because we think those things aren't important. It's just that's not what this book is about. Part of the reason why we wanted to focus on overarching governance structures at a planetary scale and at a subnational scale is that we already have, well, this might be a question. Do we have a single capitalist system since the 1970s? Or do we in fact have a variety of different mixed systems? I would argue that we actually have a variety of mixed systems that are integrated in various ways through trade circuits and so on. I don't think most people would say that the system of capitalism in this country is identical to the one in, say, Denmark, is identical to the one in, say, China. By maintaining a neutrality about that, we imagine a possibility space where people can actually come together and agree on other kinds of institutions. And the delegation function that we imagine from the planetary to the national to the subnational is precisely to maintain a possibility of pluralism that can get people to come together. That might not be totally satisfactory, but that is why we bracketed that.
Helpful.
Sovereignty. So I agree, Tosa, that like politically, it's not necessarily politically useless when we're taking away sovereignty. So you can even just look, right? a couple months ago, just 3-4 months ago, around the negotiations of the new or proposed pandemic treaty, which was kind of going to be a big post-COVID, let's get together and make sure that doesn't happen again. Like it broke down, at least in its current iteration, explicitly. You had Republicans in the U.S. Senate, Tories in the British Parliament saying like, no, like this thing, the WHO wants to like erode our sovereignty, like they can go shove it somewhere, right? Like, and despite the fact that we all know, like, yeah, wouldn't it be better if like we kind of all got together and didn't let that happen again? But explicitly on these grounds of sovereignty, they're like, no, we still want to do that. So I agree, like calling it like that in a kind of in terms of like a political strategy is probably not the right thing. But and the other kind of paradoxical thing here is that historically, my view, and I like it from the political scientist Stephen Krasner, basically it's only strong, confident states are like willing to give up any bit of sovereignty, right? Like it takes this sort of, I guess, sovereign confidence, which I guess psychologically somewhat makes sense, to actually be able to give some up. And like the kind of thing, we've already talked about this kind of federalist moment of the 1950s, right? Where you had all these federal experiments or proposals in the Caribbean, West Africa, et cetera. But like what, of course, was the only one of them that succeeded was the European project, right? Like which was happening at the exact same moment, like, but they were actually, because, the colonial, the strong, wealthy states of Europe were willing to give up bits of their sovereignty, I mean, we could debate exactly how much, to this new supranational authority, in a way that's, kind of only gotten stronger and stronger over time, whereas in every other place, it fell apart. So,
And by the way, like the only reason why this has happened in Europe at all is because of the horrible things that went on in the first half of the 20th century. So the prospect of changing, governance structures usually takes place in the wake of crisis.
Alex Kepper, Eric, and then Bettina. And I'll take one question if there's one from online, but I think Alex.
Hi, nice to meet you, Alexander Geppert. I'm a space historian here at NYU, and I've been thinking about monetization for a while. I'm currently teaching a class on planetary history, hence I was excited to publish Time. I've actually read it, so I don't know. When you give all these like book presentations, it's probably rare that people have read it. Yeah, okay. Lots of like, yeah. And so I was really excited at the beginning, but then I got more and more skeptical over time to be present. And I'll limit myself to two remarks. The first one is, a space historian is something that I have to ask, namely your notion of planetarity, which you clearly import from Chakrabarty. Chakrabarty at least hints to sort of, I mean, he says planetarity is necessarily comparative to enterprise. You seem surprisingly defensive when it came to discussing sort of the boundaries of Earth, anything sort of other planets. I mean, all the like data that comes from actually beyond the atmosphere. And so I thought there was like, you call planetary as a concept, it's a category, it's a condition. I looked it up, used the term 906 times in the book. And at the end, I thought it was a really flat definition. I didn't understand any more what you mean. It's only clear that everything planetary is good and everything global is bad. And I actually wanted to play sort of, okay, I don't have that much time either, but sort of in many senses, I had the impression the sentence would not change or the meaning would not change if I replaced your notion of planetary with sort of global. And so that left me kind of like unsatisfied. The second notion, or the second question, or the second comment is more about the third part, where you propose this model of sort of world governments, and I'll be very short. World governance and sort of technocrats have to take over, and experts have to be sort of in charge. And fair enough, you don't say how this is supposed to happen. You call it a call for action. It's not a blueprint. You just repeated it, but still. Where should the power come from? Who would control these sort of institutions? I mean, how are they democratic after all? And at the end, I mean, I've never been to the Berggruen Institute, but at the end of the book, I had this sort of horrible scenario where basically Berggruen institutes all over the world, full of technocrats, probably really well paid by like one rich guy, kind of solve the issues. And I'm like, okay, fair enough. I share your compassion. I share your diagnosis. But I'm sorry, this can't be it. Maybe the world should rather go down than being sort of governed by institutes full of technocrats, who I think can be, yeah. Okay, may I stop here? But so at the end, I was really worried.
Great. Eric, hold on.
Yeah,
because
better hold on.
These are important questions.
So, first of all, I mean, your response that you kind of like started excited and got angry by the end.
No, angry is not the right
is
term.
precisely
No,
the response. Like,
angry.
you
Worried.
already said, like,
Worried.
it's out there because like, you should be angry. Oh, like so come up with a better response. I mean, it's partly our call to everyone.
I didn't say angry.
Okay, we should have been angry. No.
Okay, no.
So, I mean, the answer is like, absolutely, we're not proposing that like, it's things like that. So I can understand why that, might seem what we're calling for. For your first thing, I mean, so to the concept of the planetary, I mean, I think I just disagree, which is, I mean, maybe unsurprising. Because like, I think, like, as you said, from Turk, we take these to mean very different things. And I think, like, yes, in plain language, you could swap the two terms because in plain language, they are used interchangeably. But I don't think it's true that if you kind of take the weight that we put on one word versus the other, it makes sense to swap them. And I also just don't think that everything that Planetary is good and global is bad. Like, I think we try to be quite clear, and maybe obviously we weren't, that not everything that is global is Planetary and vice versa. There are still many global things that require, say, global governance, that are like, a lot of people think we're basically making an argument to do precisely, I think, this, which is that like, well, just everyone should stop saying global and start saying Planetary.
Exactly.
And that's precisely not what we want. And again, we're not the clearest in the book about this, but that's certainly not the project. The project is to draw a distinction between these two, not a normative distinction, but just to say these are different categories that require different ways of thinking and different ways of acting. Not that one is better than the other, but just that they're different.
Horses for course. Yeah, let me just say two other things about the technocracy charge. First of all, I'll just say that I'm a little surprised about the comment about us feeling defensive about things from outside. We actually have another space historian who's a colleague of ours who we've been in strong dialogue with on this topic. And one of the topics we hint at, or at least we allude to a couple of times that we think is a quintessential planetary challenge, is the problem of space junk. And we think that again is something that's not governed effectively by cannot be governed effectively by national institutions. And I do think that, it's hard for me to know. I haven't looked at the data enough, but certainly if we are significantly worried about things like asteroid strikes as a threat, that certainly would be something that needs to be dealt with by some kind of a planetary agency. And I don't know how seriously to take. When I say I don't know how seriously to take it, I really mean I don't know how seriously to take it. I'm not dismissing it. So I'm a little surprised about the comment about us being defensive about the extraplanetary, because actually thinking about the extraplanetary has been part of what we use to conceive the planetary.
More than but it's only useful in the sense that it helps us reflect back on this planet. I mean, I am entirely indifferent to Mars. Like
I like it a little more.
I mean,
The footnote
Earth
of
is
284. The footnote of 284.
Page 284, I'll see what you say.
But yeah, like other, I mean, like space to me is like, it helps us think about this planet, but this planet is a vessel of life, by which I mean not just human life, but all life. We have, as far as we know, the only biosphere in the universe. Like, I could not give any shits about other planets to the extent that that's my view. I
want to be really, you want to talk about footnote on 84, 284, is that?
We don't talk about that.
So I'm glad we got that transition because we got very granular.
Yeah.
And I want to just shift the perspective in a different way. And I think for me, the kind of triumph of what's done here is that you just presented one of the most preposterous arguments that I've heard in my career as an academic. And it's completely exciting and has got all of us engaged, and where everyone's still sitting in the room trying to work through this bold argument. If it weren't preposterous, it wouldn't be useful, right? Because the point is, this could happen centuries from now, but let's plant a seed. And so it's just there's lots of things I'm skeptical about. And I think that's what the invitation is.
Yeah.
But I just want to note, I guess, the comment for the room, it's an exciting intellectual exercise to think through it. I think each of these comments has spoken to something important. For me, the core challenge comes up, which has been coming up in different ways, has to do with the fact that the legitimacy of nation states is so predicated on the security of the people governs, and that at the heart of that is kind of economic security and also increasing ecological security. I think the space junk and even the pandemics are slightly adjacent to the core problem, which is the climate problem for this. Did Japan or Australia have a national solution to COVID? Maybe they did. That's an interesting thing to think about. But the problem on the economic and ecological security is that to deal with that, nation state would have to give up an extraordinary amount of control. And because we're structured around so much inequality, and because we have such a small number of incredibly wealthy and powerful nation states that are structuring the system we're in, I'm struggling to figure out the scenario in which they cede authority in the ways that they have it around atomic energy. And you don't have to answer it even, but that, for me, that's kind of the core question. It's what's the crisis that's strong enough to compel the United States or China into this kind of solution.
Yeah,
And,
so,
and I just think it's really worth thinking about.
yeah, so let me- can I-
It wasn't COVID, right?
I just want to make one comment. So I'm glad you thought it was preposterous. That actually is the goal.
Yeah.
I used to work in a scenario planning shop, and a lot of what we were expected to do in that shop, I worked with national security clients on ecological and environmental security issues, and it was thinking the unthinkable was the cliche. And actually, that was what we were, there's an element of that in this book.
I meant it in a flattering way.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it as such, Eric. I will say that I think that there's a fundamental, and I think you're actually hinting at this, if I'm understanding your question correctly. There's actually a contradiction between economic security understood as sovereign control and ecological security, which cannot be managed. It can maybe be, adaptation issues can be managed to a certain extent. But the problem is stretching our imagination to imagine how bad the ecological crisis is going to be in 100 years or 150 years, with how long it took for Kant's crazy proposals to be realized. If we don't do anything about these things, we will have ecological crises, which will make our economic crises seem very minor.
A minute hold for one last question from.
I just wanted to ask this, it's a very basic pragmatic question about the levels of audience that you're interested in. Because it's one thing to sort of get a room full of scholars, excited, and it's another thing that it did seem to me from what you were saying, certainly the third part of the book, is normative to some degree, prescriptive, and presumably you want, who is the audience for that? I mean, is it that you want to, is it that you're going to sit in front of a congressional committee? Is it that you think that the folks at Jackson who have been with the WTO? In other words, we obviously are not the decision makers who could do this, and you could excite us, but sort of, you're thinking very pragmatically in some way, it seems to me. And I'm just curious how you see those levels work in terms of your own notion of audience and effect.
And Shahrazad, very brief.
Can I ask my, so I like a lot of what you said. It starts out good. I did find some of it preposterous, as Eric said. Some of it in a good way. I'm very, I've said many things people would call utopian, so I'm not, jumping on that. But I do think that for a work that's so aspirational, there is a failure of imagination to suggest, in a world in which, as so many people have pointed out, the capitalist system, the economic system, and every other system are so intertwined. There is a failure of imagination to assume that the only economic options before us are capitalism as it exists today, degrowth as you've described it, or like communism. And I think the comments about turning to other sources is not about the citations. It's about taking seriously those perspectives that are trying to fundamentally resolve our relationship with the planet and with each other.
I'll let you take that one. I'll talk about the audiences. So one way to think about the audiences problem is the different people we've come out and talked to about this. So one is an organization like this one. We've done a lot of academic briefings, but we've also done briefings with the Brookings Institution, the RAND, and it may surprise you that these people you think of as practical have been a lot less skeptical of our preposterous things than some of the supposedly pie head in the sky academics are. And maybe that's related a little bit to the question that you're asking over here, because right, a discussion in the morning, exactly. We're also working, the next phase of this project will be to be working with Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's the head of the New America Foundation, to try to create a templated curriculum that can become a standard part of the training for international bureaucrats, in the same way that international economics is now considered a standard expectation that they should absolutely know something about economics. We think that they should absolutely know something about ecological issues, planetary issues, in the sense that we talk about it in the book, and that our plan is to work with international relations schools. We're also planning on working with Johns Hopkins SAIS, trying to get that embedded. So getting these categories at the end of the day identified as a problem space, even if the crazy normative, absurd things that we're proposing in the last couple of chapters are rejected, the idea that this framing of problem sets and the understanding of what's distinctive about the planetary, which maybe we haven't done adequately, that's, I think, the long-term ambition for what we want to do with this, in addition to changing some academic conversations.
So, I take your point, like, that's fine, like, I mean, I think basically, we're actually really, I mean, it's not that we like don't talk about the economy, talk about global gospel, it's like that what we're proposing in our view is agnostic to the economic system. Like, we're proposing institutions that are basically, I don't want to say content neutral, but like in some sense are able to work under any different function. I think at one point even say like, it's fully compatible with like, particularly at the local, like local levels where we think would have a lot more authority than they have now for like communities that choose to live, like they want to live in prehistory, like that, like go live in caves and like, what?
Good luck, good luck.
But whatever, but if that's your decision as a community, like, go for it, like, I don't want to live there, but like, so I think it's partly, like I said, we held it in place, not because we think it's good, but because like, if you spring open everything at the same time, it becomes less bound. I don't think we would have the same response from like, kind of like policymaking communities if we just like said like economists like to say, like, imagine a can opener, right? Like, like we just like imagine something that's like totally unrelated to what we have now and like go for it. Like we do that enough that our view was that opening up these other questions as well. Like, because then for that matter, we could say like, and in this world, humans will have wings and can just, and all that. Like, so I don't know, maybe in the end, it just comes down to the fact that like, yes, to imagine the end of the world in capitalism. I mean, maybe that's just what it is, right?
I also think, the United Nations as it exists today, we have lots of choice things to say about the United Nations systems, but it's also agnostic to particular forms of economic organization. Somebody at a previous talk we gave criticized us and said, there's no outside of capitalism. Like you can't, like, how can you just bracket that? We said that, and my reply to that is, if you really believe that there's no outside of capitalism, that argument cuts both ways. There's no outside of capitalism. Let's not talk about that. So my view is that you could have these planetary institutions that could be compatible with a variety of different modes of economic organization. That's not, I think, at odds with what we're arguing here. So if some people here want to argue for Roy Vivier or Agaciro or various other kinds of traditions of indigenous thought that explain different ways of economic relations to one another, we're totally open to those kinds of ideas.
Nils and John, may just say, may some version of your proposals take a shorter period of time than perpetual peace has taken to take place. Thank you very much, both of you, for